You didn't notice the moment the testing stopped. There was no signal, no release, no sense of having passed something. If anything, what changed was so subtle that it blended into ordinary life. Situations still appeared. Choices still had to be made. But the underlying pressure that once framed everything as a challenge quietly dissolved. The sense that life was watching you, measuring your response, waiting to see if you would get it right, faded without ceremony. That disappearance didn't feel like relief. It felt like neutrality. The field didn't announce that you were done being tested. It simply stopped applying resistance, and the reason it stopped had nothing to do with effort or improvement. It stopped because there was nothing left to push against. Earlier, your experience was organized around holding something together. You were managing orientation, meaning, timing, or identity. That management created tension, and tension invited response. The field mirrored that tension back as friction. Situations felt charged because something inside you was braced. When you finally let go, not as a strategy, but as a function ending, that brace released. You didn't decide to stop trying. Trying lost relevance. And when it did, the field had nothing to test. Testing only exists where there is resistance. When resistance ends, testing has no role. What remains is not reward or punishment. It's quiet reciprocity. Life responds without pressure because nothing is demanding proof. This is why the change can feel anticlimactic. You were trained to expect resolution to feel dramatic. Passing a test should feel like victory. But this was never a test you could pass by performing correctly. It was a test maintained by your participation in it. The moment you stopped holding a position, the test dissolved. There was no score to settle, no result to receive. The field didn't shift in your favor. It returned to neutrality, and neutrality can feel invisible if you're used to intensity. Yet that invisibility is the confirmation. Nothing is being pushed now, nothing is being withheld. Experience unfolds without commentary. When the testing was active, every situation seemed to carry weight. Interactions felt evaluative, delays felt personal. Obstacles felt like signals you needed to decode. You were constantly adjusting yourself in response, trying to stay aligned, trying to interpret correctly. That constant adjustment kept the system engaged in proving something. Now notice what's different. Events still happen, but they no longer feel instructional. You're not asking what they mean about you. You're not scanning for whether you responded well enough. Things occur and resolve without leaving residue. That absence of residue is the key. The system is no longer storing experiences as evidence. There is no ledger being updated. This is often misunderstood as disengagement. But disengagement feels hollow. It carries avoidance and dullness. What you're experiencing now is clean. Attention is available. Responses are appropriate. Nothing is being bypassed. What's gone is the internal demand to extract meaning from every interaction. The field is no longer testing because there is no longer a self that needs to be validated through response. You're not trying to show that you trust, surrender, understand, or align. Those efforts once kept the test alive. Their absence ends it. The field doesn't reward letting go, it reflects it. When you stop pushing, nothing pushes back. When you stop asking to be evaluated, nothing evaluates you. That's not a spiritual principle. It's a functional one. Systems only test where there is resistance to test against. Once resistance ends, neutrality is restored. And neutrality doesn't feel like achievement. It feels like ordinary life without friction. That's why you might wonder whether anything changed at all. But look closely. The quiet absence of testing is not emptiness. It's the most precise confirmation that something fundamental has already completed. When the testing was still active, effort always felt justified. You had a sense that if you stayed alert enough, responsive enough, or open enough, things would eventually settle. That vigilance kept you slightly forward-leaning, even in moments of calm. You were never fully at rest, because rest felt conditional. It depended on nothing going wrong. Now notice how different rest feels. It doesn't need permission. You're not resting because you've done enough or understood enough. Rest happens because nothing is demanding engagement. The field isn't asking you to prove anything. So the system doesn't stay mobilized. That shift is not psychological, it's physiological. The body stops bracing because there's nothing to brace for. This is often where people look for a cause and effect explanation. They want to know what they did right, what insight made the difference, what moment changed the trajectory. But there isn't one. The testing didn't stop because you mastered something. It stopped because you stopped participating in the mechanism that sustained it. Trying to locate the cause only recreates the old pattern. The need to understand why keeps the system oriented toward evaluation. Letting go here wasn't an action. It was the natural end of a function that no longer served. And when a function ends naturally, there's no narrative attached to it. It simply stops running. As a result, situations that once would have triggered self-correction no longer do. You don't ask whether you responded appropriately. You don't replay conversations looking for mistakes. You don't interpret resistance as feedback about your inner state. That doesn't mean you've become careless. It means response is no longer tied to self-assessment. Correction still happens when needed, but it's local. It doesn't spread into identity. The field isn't testing because there's no longer a self-image being adjusted through interaction. Life is no longer used as a mirror to evaluate you. It's just what's happening. Another subtle change appears in how you relate to uncertainty. When the test was active, uncertainty felt like a prompt. It invited effort. You were supposed to do something with not knowing. You were meant to resolve it, trust through it, or interpret it correctly. Now uncertainty can remain unresolved without triggering movement. The system doesn't rush to fill the gap. There's no sense that something is being withheld until you respond the right way. Uncertainty loses its evaluative edge. It becomes neutral space rather than a challenge. This neutrality can feel strange because it doesn't reward you for tolerance or patience. There's no internal voice saying you handled it well. There's also no fear saying you handled it poorly. That absence of judgment is what tells you the testing framework is gone. When the field was testing, everything was graded. Now nothing is. Experience doesn't need to be passed or failed. It simply unfolds, and because it unfolds without grading, you don't organize yourself around performance. You respond when response is needed and remain still when it isn't, without turning either into a statement about who you are. This is where the phrase letting go becomes misleading. It suggests an act, a decision, a moment of surrender. What actually happened is quieter. The system stopped gripping because there was nothing left to hold. The test ended because there was no longer a participant. And without a participant, the field returns to neutrality. It doesn't congratulate you. It doesn't advance you to the next level. It simply stops applying pressure. That pressurelessness is not absence, it's alignment without effort. As this settles further, the change becomes visible in ordinary moments where you once felt subtly evaluated. A delay happens, and there is no reflex to interpret it as a sign. A plan falls through and it doesn't register as a test of patience or trust. Someone responds differently than expected, and there is no internal adjustment trying to compensate. Earlier, these moments would have activated self-monitoring. You would have checked your attitude, your openness, your alignment. Now they complete themselves without leaving a trace. Nothing is being recorded. Nothing is being measured. The absence of internal follow-up is not numbness. It is closure. The loop that once required interpretation no longer reopens. This is where many people mistakenly assume they've stopped caring. But caring used to be fused with vigilance. You cared by staying alert, by adjusting yourself constantly, by trying to respond correctly. When that vigilance drops, caring looks quieter. You still respond appropriately. You still show up. But you're no longer hovering over experience to make sure it's going well. That hovering was part of the testing mechanism. It kept the system engaged in evaluation. Without it, interaction becomes cleaner. You meet what's in front of you without trying to influence what it means. And because meaning is no longer being negotiated, situations resolve without friction. This shift also shows up in how you relate to feedback. Praise doesn't inflate you. Criticism doesn't destabilize you. Earlier, both would have been processed as information about how you were doing. Now they land and pass, not because they're ignored, but because they no longer define anything internally. Feedback becomes situational rather than existential. You can adjust behavior without adjusting identity. That separation is critical. It tells you the field is no longer testing because there is no longer a self being refined through response. There is function, but no performance. Over time, this lack of testing reshapes how you experience effort altogether. You still exert yourself where it's appropriate, but effort no longer feels like an offering. You're not doing things in hopes that life will respond differently. There's no sense of bargaining. Earlier, effort was often paired with expectation. If you tried hard enough, stayed present enough, trusted enough, something would ease. That transaction has ended. Effort now belongs entirely to the task at hand. It doesn't reach beyond it. When the task is done, effort drops without residue. This also changes how you handle difficulty. Difficulty still arises, but it doesn't feel instructional. You don't assume it's there to teach you something about letting go. You don't frame it as a lesson you need to pass. It's simply difficulty. You respond to it practically, emotionally, or physically, depending on what's needed, without turning it into a referendum on your state. That practical response would have been impossible before, because difficulty was always layered with evaluation. Now it isn't. The field isn't testing your reaction. It's just presenting a condition, and conditions don't need to be passed. They need to be met. This is where it becomes unmistakable that the letting go already happened. You're no longer oriented toward improving your relationship with life. You're no longer trying to reach a more surrendered position. Those efforts would recreate the test. The absence of that effort tells you the test is already gone. What remains is not effortlessness as an ideal, but effortlessness as a byproduct. Nothing inside is pushing against what's happening, so nothing outside needs to push back. The field doesn't test you because there is nothing left to test. As this absence of testing stabilizes, your relationship with time begins to reorganize on its own. When the test was active, time always carried implication. Delays felt like evaluations. Pauses felt like waiting rooms. The future leaned on the present, asking whether you were doing enough now to deserve what came next. That pressure shaped how you moved through days. Now notice what's different. Time still passes, but it no longer presses. Waiting doesn't feel like something you're supposed to handle correctly. Pauses don't suggest you've missed a cue. The present moment isn't being weighed against what should happen later. It simply unfolds. That neutrality tells you the field is no longer staging scenarios to observe your response. There is no timing to get right. This shift removes a subtle form of tension you may not have realized was there. You're no longer slightly ahead of yourself, monitoring whether things are progressing as they should. You're not scanning for signs that you're on track or behind. Without that scanning, time loses its emotional charge. You can be in a moment without it needing to justify itself. Nothing is late, nothing is early. There is no internal clock judging your pace. And because there is no judgment, there is no urgency. The field doesn't test timing when there's no one trying to time things correctly. Alongside this, identity continues to simplify in a way that feels almost anticlimactic. Earlier, identity was reinforced through response. You learned who you were by how you handled situations, how well you surrendered, how gracefully you adapted. That identity needed testing to stay defined. Without testing, identity loses weight. You still recognize yourself, but you're not maintaining an image of who you are becoming through interaction. There's less internal narration explaining what each experience says about you. That narration fades not because you suppress it, but because it's no longer needed to stay coherent. This is why explanation becomes optional. You don't feel compelled to articulate what's changed or to defend your way of being. If someone misunderstands you, nothing tightens. You're not required to correct their interpretation. Shared meaning is no longer necessary for internal stability. Earlier, being understood helped confirm that you were responding correctly. Now, understanding and misunderstanding coexist without friction. That independence is not isolation. It's freedom from evaluation. The field no longer tests because there is no longer an identity being shaped through approval or resistance. As this settles more deeply, even the impulse to look back and assess what changed begins to fade. Earlier, reflection served a purpose. You reviewed experiences to see whether you had responded well. whether you had learned what you were meant to learn, whether the test was truly over. That reviewing kept the system partially engaged in evaluation. Now that impulse weakens, not because you've concluded anything, but because there is nothing left to verify. The absence of testing removes the need for confirmation. You're not checking whether you're still there. You're simply here. Reflection becomes something you can do, not something you need to do to remain stable. This is also why moments of silence feel different now. Silence used to be a space where you waited for instruction or insight. It felt like a holding pattern. Now silence is just silence. It doesn't imply that something should appear. It doesn't feel like a test of patience or trust. Nothing is expected to happen inside it. That lack of expectation is crucial. When nothing is expected, nothing is withheld. The field doesn't need to provoke a response because there's no longer a role you're supposed to play. Silence no longer carries weight. It carries openness without demand. Along with this, effort loses its old symbolic meaning. You still put energy into things that matter, but effort no longer feels like an offering to life. You're not doing things to show readiness, openness, or alignment. You're not hoping effort will change how the field responds to you. That transactional layer has dissolved. Effort is now contained within the task itself. When the task ends, effort ends. There is no sense that you need to keep trying to maintain harmony. Harmony is already present because nothing is being resisted. This is where it becomes clear that the letting go wasn't an event. It was the end of a pattern where life felt like a series of situations designed to see whether you would finally relax. Once relaxation stopped being something you attempted, the pattern collapsed. The field didn't need to stop testing you. Testing stopped because the conditions for it were gone. What remains is not passivity and not control. It's participation without evaluation. You meet what appears, respond as needed, and move on without storing the experience as evidence of anything. That simplicity is not regression, it's resolution. As this reaches its natural close, even the idea of having let go loses importance. Earlier, letting go would have been something you recognized, named, and perhaps revisited as proof that you had changed. Here, it doesn't function that way. You're not holding a conclusion about yourself. You're not reminding yourself that you've released something. The system doesn't need that reminder. It's already operating without the tension that once made letting go necessary. Nothing here needs to be remembered or reinforced. The absence of testing is not something you maintain through awareness. It remains because the mechanism that sustained it is gone. This is also why there's no urge to mark this as an ending. Endings mattered when something had to be closed properly, so the next phase could begin. Here, nothing is waiting to begin. Life continues without requiring a transition ritual. You don't feel the need to seal anything or declare completion. The field isn't asking for acknowledgement. It's simply neutral, and neutrality doesn't ask to be recognized. It holds whether you notice it or not. That quiet persistence is the clearest indication that the test is no longer running. From here, nothing is required of you. Not trust, not surrender, not awareness. The field is no longer shaping situations to see how you respond, because there is no longer a response it's waiting for. You're not being prepared for something else. You're not being refined, you're simply participating. Sometimes that participation looks active. Sometimes it looks still. Neither is better, neither is safer. Both occur without being graded. This closing doesn't point forward or backward. It doesn't suggest what should happen next or how you should be. It simply recognizes what is already the case. The field didn't stop testing you because you passed. It stopped because there was no longer a self-holding tension that could be tested. What remains is ordinary life without resistance, no lesson to apply, no insight to protect, nothing to do from here.